I had worked under Miss Daniel for nearly 2 years, and in all that time, I had only ever seen her as my boss, a woman of power, elegance, and precision. She carried herself with the kind of grace that could make a room fall silent without her saying a word. At 40, she was everything I aspired to be someday: confident, respected, and untouchably composed. And one, at 26, was just her assistant, efficient, quiet, invisible in my crisp office uniform and low-heeled shoes every morning. I'd greet her with the same polite smile, place her schedule on the table, and watch as she signed papers without looking up. Her perfume lingered in the air long after she left the room, a mix of vanilla and authority. Our relationship was strictly professional, a rhythm I had learned not to disrupt. Until that one evening, the evening that changed everything. It began with a casual invitation. She had called me into her office one afternoon, her voice steady and low. "My sister's wedding is this weekend," she said while flipping through some files. "You've been helping with the coordination, haven't you?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied. She nodded without looking at me. "You should come. Consider it a gesture of appreciation." I don't know why my heart skipped at those words. Maybe because she had never invited anyone from the staff to a personal event before. Maybe because it was the first time she said something that felt almost kind. That Saturday evening, I stood in front of the mirror longer than I should have. My hair, usually tied back in a bun, now fell in soft waves over my shoulders. I wore a pale silver dress that shimmered faintly under the lights. Simple, but not plain. When I looked at my reflection, I barely recognized myself. For once, I wasn't the quiet assistant from the office. I was just a woman hoping to feel seen. The wedding venue was glowing, chandeliers, laughter, the hum of music, and the scent of flowers. I tried to blend in, to stay unnoticed among the guests. But when she walked in a black gown, her hair swept elegantly back, all sound around me seemed to blur. She carried herself like time belonged to her. Her eyes scanned the crowd and then stopped on me. I will never forget that moment. She didn't move for a second. Her gaze lingered, slow, curious, almost confused, as if she was trying to place me, trying to remember where she had seen me before. When realization hit, something in her expression softened. "Miss," she said quietly as she approached. "Julia," I reminded her, smiling nervously. My voice trembled a little. "Julia," she repeated, as if tasting the name for the first time. Her eyes swept over me, not inappropriately, but with genuine surprise. "You look—" She hesitated. "Different." The noise of the wedding seemed to fade into a low hum. My chest tightened. I wanted to say something clever, something professional, but my words disappeared somewhere between her gaze and the soft music floating through the hall. "Thank you," I finally whispered. She smiled, a rare, small curve of her lips that I had never seen in the office. "I almost didn't recognize you." Her tone wasn't flirtatious, just honest, but it was enough to make my heart flutter like I was standing too close to a flame. I caught her husband's distant glance from across the room, a reminder of where I stood, of who she was. And yet, I couldn't stop watching her. Every time she laughed, every time the light caught the edge of her hair, I felt something stirring in me, something unfamiliar and forbidden. The rest of the evening passed in slow fragments. I danced once with a coworker, but my eyes kept finding her, in conversation, in laughter, in silence. There was a moment when she passed by and our hands brushed slightly. It lasted no longer than a second, but it burned like a secret I wasn't ready to understand. Later, when I stepped outside for some air, the night was cool and the sky hung heavy with stars. I heard her heels click softly on the stone path behind me. "Enjoying yourself?" she asked. I turned, startled. "Yes, ma'am. It's beautiful." She stood beside me, her perfume faint but intoxicating. You should call me Daniel outside the office, she said. Almost casually. It felt strange, personal. All right, I murmured, my voice barely above the sound of the music drifting from inside. We stood there in silence for a while, looking out at the lights reflecting off the water. I could feel her presence beside me, steady, composed, and yet softer than I had ever known. She looked at me again, and there it was, that same quiet gaze from earlier. Not just admiration, not just surprise, but something unspoken. Something that made me feel seen in a way I had never been before. I lowered my eyes, pretending to adjust my bracelet, but inside my heart was trembling. I didn't know what to call what I felt. It wasn't love, not yet. Just an ache, a pull, an awareness that something inside me had shifted. When we finally returned inside, she introduced me to a few people, her hand gently touching the small of my back as she guided me through the crowd. Every touch was professional, but every touch lingered too long in my memory. As the night ended, I went to say goodbye. She was near the entrance, speaking to some relatives. When she saw me, she paused and said softly, "You look different today." The same words as before, but this time they carried weight. A meaning neither of us dared to name. I smiled faintly, my throat tight. "Good night, ma'am." "Good night." "Julia," she replied, her voice low, almost tender. As I walked away, I could feel her eyes following me, and I knew that the world I had known until now, the simple routine of office life, would never be the same again. Something had begun that night, quietly, invisibly, and though I didn't yet understand it, a part of me knew I was standing at the edge of something beautiful and dangerous. That was the night my boss looked at me differently, and the night I stopped being invisible. After the wedding, something subtle began to change. It wasn't dramatic or obvious at first, just quiet shifts that only I could feel. Danielle was still the same composed woman everyone admired, still the boss who commanded every meeting with calm precision. But the way she spoke to me, the way her eyes lingered a second too long, the way her tone softened when she said my name, it was different. She began calling me Julia instead of Miss Raymond. The first time she did it, it caught me off guard. We were in the middle of a staff meeting when she said, "Julia, could you get the updated report on the contract?" It sounded so ordinary to everyone else, but to me, it echoed differently. My name, spoken in her voice, felt like something secret, something delicate I had to protect. In the days that followed, she started praising my work more often. She'd stop by my desk just to say, "Good job on that presentation," or "I knew I could count on you." Simple words, but from her, they carried warmth I wasn't used to. I had always been invisible, efficient but unnoticed, yet suddenly, her attention was like sunlight on something long kept in the dark. The other employees began to notice. I could hear their whispers when I passed, small, cutting words that stung more than I wanted to admit. "She's her favorite now," one of them said. "Guess dressing up once can really pay off," another joked under her breath. I pretended not to care, but the truth was, they were entirely wrong. Daniel was treating me differently, and I didn't understand why. One afternoon, she called me into her office. I remember her sitting by the window, light spilling over her desk. "Julia," she began, "there's an upcoming conference in Paris. I'd like you to join me." I blinked, unsure I'd heard right. "Me? But I'm not part of the senior team." She smiled faintly. "You've earned it. Besides, it'll be a good opportunity to learn. Consider it professional grooming." My heart fluttered at that word, professional. It was a neat, tidy excuse for something that didn't feel tidy at all. Still, I nodded. "Thank you, ma'am." "Daniel," she corrected gently, her gaze holding mine. Outside the meeting room, just Daniel. That moment hung between us like something fragile and precious. The following weeks blurred into quiet, unspoken closeness. There were stolen glances during meetings, hands brushing when we exchanged files, moments where the silence between us felt more intimate than words. Sometimes, I'd catch her looking at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention, not like a boss assessing an employee, but like someone trying to understand the feelings she didn't have words for. And every time she did, I felt the ground shift a little more beneath my feet. On the flight to Paris, we sat side by side. She worked most of the time, eyes on her laptop, but there were moments when our elbows touched and neither of us moved away. When the plane lights dimmed and everyone fell asleep, I looked at her, her profile calm, her expression unreadable, and I wondered if she could feel the same quiet chaos that was tearing through me. At the hotel, we had adjoining rooms. She knocked on my door the first evening to discuss the schedule. She wore a plain silk blouse, her hair slightly undone from the travel. For the first time, she looked human, tired, a little vulnerable. We sat across from each other on the small couch, our knees almost touching. She was explaining the plan for the next day, but I could hardly focus on her words. The sound of her voice, the closeness, the faint smell of her perfume, it all blurred into something that made my chest ache. After a pause, she said softly, "You did very well in today's briefing." "Thank you," I replied, my voice low. "I'm just trying to keep up. You're doing more than that." She smiled, a real one this time, and it made her look younger. "You have potential, Julia, real potential." That compliment shouldn't have meant so much, but it did. It wasn't about work anymore. It was the way she said it, the warmth behind her words. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what was happening. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. She was my boss, married, older, untouchable. And yet, something in the air between us had shifted beyond control. The days that followed only deepened it. We worked side by side through long hours, sometimes sharing quiet dinners after meetings. Once, at a late dinner in a quiet restaurant by the river, she laughed, genuinely laughed, at something I said. It was soft, unguarded, and beautiful. "I didn't know you could be funny," she teased, her eyes shining. "I didn't know you could laugh," I replied before I could stop myself. Her smile faded just a little, replaced by a look I couldn't quite decipher, part fondness, part fear. Maybe I've forgotten how. We didn't talk much after that, but the silence said enough. On our final night in Paris, after the last meeting, she asked if I wanted to join her for a walk. The city was glowing, lights reflecting off wet streets, the air cool and calm. We ended up on the hotel balcony overlooking the river. The sound of the wind carried faint music from somewhere far below. She leaned against the railing, eyes distant. "Do you ever feel," she said slowly, "like you're losing control of something you didn't mean to start?" I turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" Her gaze met mine, and for a long moment she didn't speak. The city lights flickered across her face, soft and uncertain. Then she whispered, "I don't know why I can't stop thinking about you." The words hung in the air, fragile and impossible. My breath caught. I wanted to speak, to ask her what she meant, but my throat felt tight. Before I could respond, she turned away, looking out over the water again, her expression calm, but her hands trembling slightly on the railing. "Forget I said that," she murmured. "It's late. We should rest." But I couldn't forget. Not then, not ever. That night, as I lay awake in my room, the sound of the river outside my window, I realized the truth. I was already falling. Slowly, quietly, and completely. And even though every part of me knew it was wrong, the thought of her voice saying those words replayed in my mind again and again. "I don't know why I can't stop thinking about you." Neither did I. The last day of the conference was exhausting. Meetings, presentations, Endless conversations with clients whose words blurred together after hours of polite smiles. By the time we returned to the hotel, both of us were drained. I remember standing by the elevator with Daniel, both of us silent, the hum of the city outside barely reaching us. When the doors opened, she spoke softly, "Dinner?" Just one word, but I knew what it meant. Not an order, not a professional invitation. Just a quiet need to not be alone that night. I nodded. "Let me just freshen up." An hour later, we sat across from each other in the hotel's rooftop restaurant. The city stretched out beneath us, lights shimmering against the dark river, the sound of distant music floating through the air. She ordered wine. I didn't protest, though I rarely drank. The first few sips warmed my chest, softened the edges of my thoughts. For a while, we talked about work, safe, familiar ground. But soon the conversation drifted. She asked about my family, my life before the job. I told her bits and pieces, avoiding the parts that hurt. She listened quietly, her chin resting against her hand. Eyes soft in the candlelight then, for the first time. She spoke about herself. "It's strange," she said, staring into her glass. "People think I have everything. Power, respect, a family. But they never see the silence that follows me home." I didn't know what to say. She exhaled, the sound almost a sigh. "My husband, he's been distant for years. We live in the same house, but it feels like two strangers sharing a roof. Sometimes I wonder when I became invisible to him." The irony stung, because that was exactly how I used to feel before she noticed me. Invisible. I reached across the table, hesitating before resting my hand near hers. "You're not invisible," I said quietly. Her eyes lifted to mine. "You think so?" I nodded, unable to look away. There was a sadness in her expression, something that drew me closer, something that made me forget who she was and who I was supposed to be. The waiter came, interrupting the moment, but the silence that followed afterward was different, heavy, unspoken. When we finished dinner, she suggested we go up to the balcony outside the restaurant. The air was cool, the city lights blurred by mist. We stood side by side, not speaking. The wind tugged gently at her hair, and I found myself watching her reflection in the glass, the strong woman everyone admired now looking fragile and human. "I don't usually talk about my marriage," she said after a long pause. "I guess it's easier with you." "Why?" I asked. "Because you don't expect anything from me." Her words caught me off guard. Maybe she was right, or maybe she was wrong. Maybe I did expect something, though I didn't know what. She turned to me then, her eyes searching mine. "Julia," she whispered. My name sounded like a confession. The silence between us was electric. I could hear my own heartbeat. Every reason to step away screamed inside me, but I didn't move. When she reached up to brush a loose strand of hair from my face, her fingers lingered just a little too long. My breath hitched. "Daniel," I said softly, though I didn't know if it was a plea or a warning. Her hand fell away, but her eyes didn't. "I shouldn't," she whispered, as if to herself, and yet neither of us did anything to stop what followed. It wasn't planned. There were no words, just a quiet surrender to something that had been building for too long. A moment of weakness, of warmth and guilt tangled together. The feeling of her hand trembling slightly against mine. The closeness of her breath. The space between us finally collapsing. It didn't feel wrong in that moment. It felt inevitable. Hours later, when silence filled the room again, reality began to creep in like morning light under a closed door. I remember lying there, listening to the faint hum of the city below, my mind heavy with questions I didn't have the strength to answer. What had we done? What would it cost? Danielle turned slightly, her back to me. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. There was no language for that kind of confusion. No logic that could justify what had happened when I finally drifted to sleep. It was restless and brief. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the curtains. She was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, her hair slightly messy, her expression distant. The calm, composed woman I worked for was gone, replaced by someone fragile, uncertain, almost afraid. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "We should get ready for the flight." Her tone was quiet, stripped of emotion. I sat up slowly, my throat dry. "Daniel." She stood before I could finish. "Let's just not talk about it, Julia. It was a mistake." The word hit me harder than I expected. Mistake. I wanted to argue, to tell her that it hadn't felt like one. But deep down, I knew she was right. It was a mistake, one that had crossed lines neither of us could ever uncross. We dressed in silence, the air heavy between us. At the airport, we spoke only about work, our words clipped and formal, as though the night before had never existed. By the time we landed back home, she was back to being my boss, calm, untouchable, professional. No one around us would ever have guessed what had happened. But I knew. Every time I looked at her, I could still feel that unspoken memory between us, alive, raw, buried beneath layers of silence. When I returned to my apartment that evening, I sat alone for hours, staring at the city lights through my window. The room felt too quiet, my thoughts too loud. That night, I realized something cruelly true, that one moment could change everything, and yet change nothing at all. She was still my boss. I was still her employee. The world had not shifted on its axis, and yet something inside me had cracked beyond repair. My voice trembled as I whispered into the silence. That night changed everything, and nothing at all. Back at the office, everything looked the same glass walls, the same polished desks, the same mechanical rhythm of keyboards clicking and phones ringing. But beneath that surface, everything had changed. Daniel barely looked at me in meetings anymore. She spoke in short sentences, never used my name, never allowed our eyes to meet for too long. To everyone else, it probably looked like she was just being her usual composed, professional self. But I could feel the difference, the way she hesitated before walking past my desk, the way her hands would tremble ever so slightly when I handed her a report. I told myself it was better this way. That distance would save us. But distance, I realized, doesn't work when the heart refuses to cooperate. The first time she asked me to stay late again, I knew what it meant, not in words, but in the silence that followed after the others had gone. She sat at her desk pretending to go through files, and I sat at mine pretending to type. Neither of us moved, both waiting for the other to break. When she finally stood up and came to me, she didn't speak. She just placed her hand on the back of my chair, a small, trembling gesture that said everything words couldn't. After that, we stopped pretending. We started meeting outside work, quiet cafes where no one knew us. Short drives to nowhere, stolen lunches where we'd sit in her car with the windows slightly rolled down, the air heavy with perfume and guilt. She would talk about her day, her stress, her clients, and then suddenly grow quiet, eyes softening as if she wanted to say something real but didn't know how. Sometimes she reached out to hold my hand across the console, fingers brushing mine with a kind of gentleness that only makes the ache worse. I should have stopped her. I should have stopped myself. But I didn't, because when she looked at me, not as her employee, not as a junior, but as someone she needed, I felt seen in a way I never had before. And that kind of attention becomes an addiction. I began losing focus at work. I'd catch myself staring at her during presentations, watching the way her lips moved when she spoke, the way she brushed her hair back when she was nervous. Everything about her became a study, a language I couldn't stop learning. Rumors began to spread again. Colleagues whispered behind my back, She's too close to the boss. No wonder she gets all the opportunities. I tried to ignore them, but each word stung like truth. Because deep down, I knew I wasn't her employee anymore. I was her secret. She started calling me from her personal number. Short messages in the middle of the night. Are you awake? Or can't sleep? Thinking about today. Sometimes I reply. Sometimes I just stare at the screen, my chest tight with everything unsaid. She promised she'd figure things out, that she'd talk to him soon. But those promises became like fog, visible for a moment. Then gone to her husband was a shadow in her words. A man she rarely mentioned, but one whose presence filled every empty space between us. Whenever his name slipped into conversation, her expression changed: guilt, fear, hesitation. And that's when I'd realize how fragile our little world really was. I started feeling the weight of it, the secrecy, the lies, the stolen glances. The way we had to pretend not to know each other too. Well, when others were around, there were nights when I would come home and sit by my window, staring at the city lights, wondering what we were doing. This wasn't love. Not the kind people wrote stories about. This was something quieter, heavier, love trapped inside walls of guilt and denial. And yet, I couldn't walk away because every time I tried, she'd pull me back with something simple, a text, a glance, a memory. She'd whisper, I don't want to lose you. And I'd whisper back, then don't. But both of us knew we were lying. One afternoon, everything shifted. I was at my desk, sorting documents for a meeting when the elevator doors opened. I looked up and froze. Her husband stepped out, tall, confident, wearing the kind of smile that hides arrogance more than kindness. He walked straight toward Daniel's office, nodding at a few people on the way. Everyone noticed. The husband rarely visited. Through the glass wall, I could see them talking. Her posture was stiff, her smile too forced. He leaned closer, whispering something that made her flinch slightly. Then suddenly, his eyes turned toward me. For one suspended moment, our gazes met. It was as if he already knew. My pulse pounded in my ears. I dropped my pen, pretending to look busy, but I could feel the weight of his stare, assessing, suspicious, sharp. Daniel noticed it too. She stood, placed a hand on his arm, and said something quickly. He looked away, nodded, and smiled again. But the damage was done. When he left, she didn't come out of her office for hours. She canceled her meetings, closed her blinds, and when I knocked softly to ask if she needed anything, her voice came from behind the door, low and tired. Please, not now. That was the last time we spoke that week. I sat at my desk, staring at her closed door, feeling something inside me begin to unravel. I had loved her in silence, in stolen moments, in the shadows. But shadows always fade when the light finds them, and I knew, deep down, that the light was coming. Months passed, slow, heavy, and quiet. Life didn't break dramatically after she left. It simply dissolved into stillness. The mornings were no longer rushed, no emails to check before sunrise, no sound of heels echoing down the corridor, no name whispered across the glass walls of an office that had once felt like a world of its own. I moved cities, found a small apartment with peeling white walls and a balcony that looked out over a street of strangers. My new job was nothing like the old one. Smaller firm, slower pace, kinder people. They didn't know my history, and I never offered it. It was peaceful. In a way, that hollow kind of peace that follows after a storm, when everything looks intact but smells faintly of rain and lost. At first, I checked her social media every few days, then every week, then only when I couldn't help myself. She looked the same, perfect, polished, untouchable. Photos of business trips, award ceremonies, dinners with colleagues. Her husband still by her side, his hand on her waist like a claim she had accepted again. She smiled in every picture, but her eyes looked tired. The kind of tired that makeup couldn't hide. Sometimes I wondered if she ever thought of me. If she scrolled through her phone late at night and paused on a message she never deleted. Or if she'd erased it all the day she walked away. I told myself I didn't care. That lies are easy when no one is around to hear them. There were nights when I still woke up with her voice in my head, low, calm, deliberate, saying my name the way she used to when no one else was around. I would lie there, staring at the ceiling, the ache of memory pressing down on my chest. She once told me, "I don't know why I can't stop thinking about you." And I had believed her. Maybe she meant it. Maybe she didn't. But those words had built something inside me that took months to tear down Dot in my new office. People often said I was too serious, too quiet, too careful. They didn't know that I was learning how to exist again without being afraid of my own feelings, without mistaking attention for affection, without expecting someone's voice to carry warmth just because it used to. Love had cost me my peace, that much I knew. It had taken my innocence, the easy trust I used to give so freely. It had made me a stranger to myself for a while, but I couldn't hate her. No matter how hard I tried, I didn't hate her when I saw her smiling beside the man she had chosen. I didn't hate her when I found out she'd been promoted again. I didn't hate her even when I realized she had. Probably forgotten me completely. I just wished. She had loved me differently, that was all. I wished she hadn't built something so beautiful only to abandon it halfway. I wish she hadn't taught me the warmth of her world. If she was going to shut the door behind me, but wishes don't undo what's done. One evening, as the sun dipped below the buildings and the city lights began to flicker on, I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee. The air was soft, touched with the smell of rain. For the first time in months, I let myself think of her, not with anger, not with longing, but with a quiet sort of acceptance. Some loves aren't meant to last. They aren't meant to be understood or defended. They simply arrive, change everything, and leave you standing in the ruins, softer, wiser, lonelier, but somehow more human than before. Maybe that was what she was meant to be for me. Not a forever, but a reminder. A lesson in how fragile the heart can be when it finds comfort in the wrong hands. I closed my eyes and remembered that first morning, the sound of her heels, the faint perfume in the air, the way she had looked at me over her glasses and said, almost teasingly, "You look different today." It was such a small thing, a line that had felt harmless at the time, but it had been the beginning. The thread that unraveled everything that followed. And in some way, it was also the end, because I did look different that day, not on the outside, but somewhere deep within. Something in me had woken up, something that would never sleep again. I smiled faintly, setting my coffee down. The sky had turned violet, the kind of shade that feels like memory itself, beautiful and unreachable. Maybe she would always live somewhere inside me. Like an unfinished sentence. Maybe I would always carry her voice, her scent, her silence, but I had learned to breathe without her, to exist without waiting for a message that would never come. That, I realized, was what healing truly was, not forgetting, but learning to remember without falling apart. Dot, as the evening faded and the city lights shimmered below. I whispered into the wind, half to her, half to myself, "You look different today." And for the first time, I smiled and believed it because I was asterisk. It happened faster than I could have ever imagined, the unraveling of everything we had built in silence. There had been whispers in the office for weeks, a shift in the way people looked at me when I passed, eyes lingering a little too long. I had tried to ignore it, convincing myself that no one truly knew. But secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, have a way of finding air. Dot started with a rumor, someone claiming they'd seen us together too often, staying late after meetings, sitting too close during flights. Then one day, Daniel stopped coming to work. She canceled meetings, avoided calls. I texted her once, then twice, then more. No reply. The silence was deafening. By the end of that week, I knew something was wrong. When she finally returned, her eyes told me everything before her words could. They were red-rimmed, tired, hollow in a way I'd never seen. She walked past me in the corridor without a single glance. My stomach twisted. Later that day, her assistant handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a note, short, cold, detached. Please focus on your work and avoid unnecessary communication. We'll speak when appropriate. Danielle. The words blurred as I read them. That wasn't her voice. That wasn't the woman who once said she couldn't stop thinking about me. I found out the truth 2 days later through the office, whispers I had once ignored. Her husband had found messages, fragments of our conversations, words that weren't explicit but carried meaning. Someone had seen us together on one of the foreign trips and mentioned it casually to him at a company event. From there, the story had built itself, brick by brick, until it crashed through the walls we had tried to keep intact. That night, I imagined the confrontation. Him shouting, her silent, tears she would never admit to crying. I imagined him asking who I was, and her saying my name like it was something shameful. And maybe it was after that, everything changed. She stopped looking at me altogether. The warmth, the softness, gone. In its place was distance, professional and sharp, like glass between us. Meetings became brief, emails curt. If she passed me in the hallway, she would nod politely, the way you would to a stranger, but strangers didn't have memories that burned like ours. I texted her one last time, just 5 words. Are you okay, Daniel? The message showed seen, but no reply ever came. The next morning, HR called me in. There's been a departmental restructure, they said, their tone rehearsed. You'll be moved to the logistics branch, different building, new supervisor. I understood what that meant. She had arranged it. She wanted me gone, not fired. That would draw attention. Just out of sight, where I couldn't be a reminder. That afternoon, I went to clear my desk. Everyone watched silently, pretending to be busy. The laughter that usually filled the floor was gone. The sound of my heels against the marble felt too loud, too final. When I reached her office, her door was closed. I stood there for a moment, staring at the frosted glass. My reflection stared back at me, tired, hollow, heartbroken. For a second, I thought about knocking, about asking her why, about reminding her of the night she told me she couldn't stop thinking about me. But I single quotes T. I just walked away. That evening, I stayed long after everyone had gone home. The office was dark, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound left. I sat at my desk, staring at the empty doorway where she used to appear every morning, coffee in hand. Sharp and calm. It felt unreal that it was over, not just whatever we had, but the quiet rhythm that used to fill my days. I pulled open a drawer and found the old conference badge from Paris. Her handwriting on the back, "Don't lose this." Julia. My chest tightened. I pressed the badge to my lips. Tears spilling before I could stop them. She once said she couldn't stop thinking about me. I whispered into the empty room. But now she pretended I never existed. The clock ticked softly in the silence that followed. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe minutes, maybe hours. The weight of everything we had done, everything we had lost, pressed down until I could barely breathe. By the time I stood up, the city outside had fallen quiet. I looked around the office one last time, the desk where she'd once smiled at me, the glass wall where her reflection had lingered beside mine, the chair she'd leaned against when she told me to call her by her first name. All of it now felt like scenes from a dream. That had gone too far. I took a blank sheet of paper and began to write. My resignation letter was short, simple, emotionless, like the note she'd once sent me. Dear Miss Daniel, I appreciate the opportunities this position has given me. It's time for me to move on. Julia Raymond. No explanations. No blame. Just a quiet goodbye. I placed it on her desk, weighing it down with her pen. The same pen she'd once handed me during our first meeting years ago, as I walked out. I didn't look back, but I could feel the ache growing behind me, like a shadow that refused to let go. Outside, the night was cold. Streetlights glowed faintly against the drizzle. I stood there for a moment, my hands shaking, realizing I had nothing left to hold on to. That was the moment I understood heartbreak, not the kind that screams or shatters, but the kind that whispers goodbye in silence, the kind that leaves you hollow but still standing. And as I walked away from the building that had once been everything, my job, my purpose, my secret, I knew one truth too well. She had broken my heart not by leaving, but by pretending she never felt anything at all.